Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. We will continue our discussion on unemployment. The discussion today is on demand-deficient unemployment, or also known as cyclical unemployment. Cyclical or demand-deficient unemployment is triggered by a drop or a decline in the aggregate demand in the economy. And this is very much sensitive to the business cycle, especially when we have a recession or trough in the cycle. And remember, we learned earlier that the demand for labor is a derived demand. When there is a decline in the GDP level, less production taken place in the economy, the demand for labor will also decline, and therefore that triggers cyclical or demand-deficient unemployment. And as a consequence of that, it will also affect the labor market flows and also the level of wage rate in the economy. And here we can refer to three important flows based on the stock flow diagram. Whenever there is a recession, the flow from those employed to those unemployed will increase. And as a consequence of that, the fraction or the probability of PEU will increase. This means higher level of unemployment will happen in the economy. Another possibility is the flow between N to E, not in labor force, to employment will decrease. Remember, there is a recession, and because of that, the chance for those not in the labor force to get any types of employment will be lower, and that's indicated by the decrease in this fraction. And next, the flow from those unemployed to employed will decrease. And this is obvious because during a recession, many those who are unemployed will find it is harder to get employment, and as a consequence of that, this fraction, PUE, will also decrease. Note that all these three fractions and the direction of the arrows for each of them contributes to higher level of unemployment rate in the economy, and this is mainly due to recession. And to understand further the effect of recession and how it can affect the level of employment in the economy, we can refer to this diagram. We had seen this diagram earlier. Now we want to relate this diagram to demand-deficient unemployment. So S0 and D0, these are the original supply and demand for labor. And this is the point where we have the original equilibrium. Now, let's say there is a recession in the economy. As a result of that, the demand for labor shifts to the left. Assuming that the wage rate is inflexible, this is usually true in the short run, we will find that the level of employment will drop from E0 to E1. However, if the wage rate is flexible, the effect of recession will put a downward pressure to the wage rate, and adjustment will take place in the labor market such that we will move from the original equilibrium point to this new equilibrium point, where at this point we will have a new level of wage rate, which is W2, much lower than the previous one, and here we will find the level of employment will drop from E0 to E2. Here, the difference between a case of inflexible wage rate, the level of unemployment will be larger as compared to having a flexible wage rate. From that observation, it is interesting for us to understand the concept of downward wage rigidity. Wage rigidity refers to the inflexible wage movement, either upward or downward. So when we say wage rate, remember we have two concepts about this: nominal wage and real wage. Real wage can fall, for example, because of inflation effect. And whenever there is cut in workers' nominal wage, this also will reduce the value of real wage received by workers. Studies about wage rigidity found various ways to understand the behavior of wage movement. Depending on the scope of the analysis, we will find few interesting explanation about the concept of wage rigidity. Now we want to understand that, and to do that, we ask these two important questions. The first one is, why do firms find it more profitable to reduce employment than wage rate? And second, why are workers who face unemployment not more willing to take wage cut to save their jobs? To understand the above two questions, we need to see various contexts of wage rigidity. The first one is the context of wage rigidity and union. So when we say union, employers, they are not free to decide on the level of employment or the level of wage rate for their workers unilaterally. They need to discuss the matter with the union. So whenever there is a union in a particular industry or in a particular firm, the union first would protect the union members. So if firms need to choose between employment and wage cut, firms usually would protect the union workers first. The non-union members would have to face layoff. Another possibility is if all workers are union members, then unions usually would protect employment of their members by having to agree on wage cut. So here we see various dynamics in the negotiation between union and employers, and therefore whether wage is rigid or not, it depends on the negotiation between the parties involved. Another thing about wage rigidity is its relationship with specific human capital. When we say human capital, employers sometimes provide trainings to their workers, especially if we talk about firm-specific human capital investment. So for these workers who receive this specific training, they are more valuable as compared to the other workers from the firm's perspective. And in this case, firms would like to retain this type of workers as compared to workers who have not undertaken any training or specific training. So here, layoff usually happen to the least experienced workers. Between employment and wage cut, firms usually would lay off the least experienced workers, and firms would hold cutting wage of their workers because that can affect morale of the workers also. So if someone needs to go, firms would choose the least experienced or the least qualified workers. And between wage rigidity and asymmetric information, and these points talks about the asymmetric information between employers and employees in terms of their path of development. Some firms are very transparent about career path of their workers, while some other firms, it is very abstract. It is much trickier when the development path is abstract. And in that situation, workers are more likely to be laid off compared to a case when the path of development is clearer. Firms usually need to honor that, and they are less likely to lay off the workers. And here, asymmetric information refers to different sets of information available to the management of the firms and the workers. Sometimes the management arrives at certain decision, let's say, to lay off some workers because they have the information that there is less demand for the firm's product. However, workers may think otherwise. And in this case, it will create mistrust between the two parties. Now, because of the asymmetric information, there is miscommunication and it changes behavior or perception of the workers towards the firm. Workers' attitude later changed, and in this case, it is easier for the firms to lay off these workers than to cut the wage of the other workers, because the firm now can get rid of these problematic workers. That's the idea of this particular slide on wage rigidity and asymmetric information. Studies also probes into the relationship between wage rigidity and risk aversion. Firms have some form of risk aversion, especially when dealing with their senior workers. The senior workers, they are valuable assets to the firms. When there is a situation where firms need to decide on laying off some of the workers, Firms usually will do the LIFO strategy, where last in, first out strategy of employment will be undertaken. That means instead of cutting the wage of the senior workers, which will affect their morale and motivation and perception towards the firm's management, firms rather would lay off the junior workers last in. They are the one that will be first out from the firms when the firm need to lay off some of the workers as a result of a recession. There is also a risk aversion within the workers themselves. When we talk about internal labor market, within the internal labor market, the risk of income or wage fluctuations are more confined to the junior workers as compared to the senior workers. Senior workers, they are less likely to be affected by any wage cut. Wage cut is more likely to happen to the junior workers. So for the junior workers, they are more likely to be laid off. They are more likely to face the possibility of wage cut. Next, studies also probe into the relationship between wage rigidity and worker status and social norms. There are large and small firms. Large firms, they are more regulated, such as the corporations. They are more scrutinized by the law as compared to small firms, such as small and medium enterprises. In this case, those who work in large firms, they are less likely to face unemployment during a business contraction or downturn. However, for those who work with the smaller firms, these firms in general pay lower wage and are not constrained as much as the large firms. And these firms are not constrained from reducing wages or even from laying off workers. So the dynamics between large firms and small firms also need to be investigated in understanding the concept of wage rigidity. Another thing about wage rigidity is about the social norms. Studies found that unemployed workers, due to layoff, they do not flock to low-wage employers due to their sense of status. What it means here is that individuals may prefer unemployment in a good job, such as in a big company, than being employed in an inferior one. What it means here is that some workers, they prefer to remain unemployed than being employed by a much smaller firms. Rather, this person may stay unemployed for a certain period. This is due to the idea of status. So because of the hesitance or reluctance of these workers to take up jobs with the smaller firms, this would make the process of recovery much slower. I think that's all for this time. Please read the textbook to understand further about the discussion today. See you next time. Wassalam.